Megan Evans co-founded the Alberta Native Bee Council in 2017. She holds a bachelor's degree in environmental science and master's degree in ecology. Megan is the executive director of the Alberta Invasive Species Council and president of the Alberta Native Bee Council. She became interested in bees when she worked as a summer student on a pollinator research study with Agriculture Canada. Welcome, Megan.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here tonight. We're really proud and really excited to be a new Nature Alberta member. I think it's such a great fit. And we're excited to be connecting with Nature Alberta people tonight. I can't believe the turnout. Wow, like it's lovely outside here where I am. I can't believe everyone has chosen to spend their evening here, which is great. And I'm really excited. So tonight we're going to talk all about native bees, the wonderful world of bees. And I hope that you all will be just as excited about bees by the end of the talk if you are not already. So see if I can advance my slides here. I'm going to move this thing. Oh, there we go. There, we just got to get the kinks out of the Zoom at the beginning and we're good to go. So perfect. So Steph, can you just jump on and tell me when you would like me to stop talking and I will time myself. I think you told me earlier and I've forgotten.
About an hour.
About an hour. Okay, perfect. Then we've got lots of time. So
perfect.
So what we're going to do with that hour, we're going to first talk about the biodiversity of insects in general. Insects are super species rich and there's so many of them. They're so important to us. I see a few fellow entomologists that have joined us here tonight. So we all know how important our insects are. Then we're going to focus in on the diversity of our native bee species, which is really kind of the area where I focus my work. And then we'll talk about the native bee life cycles and habitats and learn how they live, where they live, and what you can do to help them. And we'll, of course, talk about the very important difference between our managed bee species and our native bees. That's a really important takeaway that we want to get across. And then we'll focus in on the Alberta Native Bee Council projects and what we've been up to in the first 5 years, because we've been busy. So there's lots going on. So this is a pie chart, a really basic pie chart, an estimate of global animal biodiversity. And each one of these pieces of pie is made up by the total number of species within each taxonomic group. Now, you don't have to be a statistician to look at this and realize that insects, are by far the most species-rich group of animals that we have on the planet. And so there's a tremendous diversity in our insect species. And when we talk about biodiversity, this is what we mean, this pie chart. But when we really kind of start talking about conservation of biodiversity, our focus often becomes much more narrow. And most of those conservation resources are devoted to a small sliver of this pie, the charismatic megafauna of the animal world. But insects are really important to us. So insects are important to us. Of course, bees are important because of the pollination services that they provide, both in our natural ecosystems and pollinating native plants, but also in our agricultural systems where they pollinate crops and are really important to farmers' bottom lines. But insects are important for nutrient cycling. I hope you can see this GIF of these dung beetles rolling the dung. I've told people before, if I didn't study bees, I think I would go back in time and learn more about dung beetles. They're so fascinating. And dung beetles, along with other insects and microbes, are really important in decomposing organic matter. And without them, here in Alberta, we'd be under miles and miles of cow dung and other organic matter. So those are really important ecosystem services that they're providing to us for free. Insects provide pest control services, so they eat other insects. There's lots of insect species, wasps, all kinds of things that eat other insects. And similarly, insects are a really important food source for other animals. So even though individual insect species or individuals are very, very little, there's just so many of them that they provide a huge amount of biomass into our food systems and our trophic levels. And there was a study that was done now in 2006, almost 20 years old, if you can imagine. And researchers estimated, the value of those ecosystem services provided to us by insects. And this doesn't even count the managed insects like honeybees. This is just, wild insects. And they estimated that it was about $57 billion a year that insects are providing to us in the ecosystem services that they provide, which is a huge, huge number and would be much more in today's dollars. Now, insects are super important to us, but for a long time, researchers have been raising alarm bells that they're declining. And for many, many years, it was a lot of anecdotal evidence. So it was researchers or people driving to their cabin every year for 50 years, and they just don't have to squeegee their windshields like they used to. But more recently, we have strong empirical evidence that backs up that we are experiencing insect declines. So I've got a couple of examples on the screen here. The first was a study done in Germany, in protected areas in Germany, and that researcher found a 75% decline in insect biomass, which is a good proxy for abundance. So insect biomass over 27 years. So that 75% decline in protected areas, which should be some of the most pristine habitat, absolutely a really alarming study when that came out. And even more recently, other researchers did a meta-analysis looking at all the other studies, and they kind of extrapolated and projected that we can expect to see about 40% of our insect species that will be at risk of extinction over the next few decades. Now, this second paper was met with some criticism that it was alarmist, and it was just really trying to have a bunch of bells and whistles. But I would say that we probably need to have more studies like this and more statements like this, because we need to be very concerned about these insect declines. So we're probably not feeling insect declines so much so now as humans through the loss of ecosystem services, but that is a matter of when and not if. We will feel those impacts eventually, and we really need to do more to protect our insects species across the world. So how are our bees doing? Well, the General Status of Species in Canada report is published every 5 years, and the most recent 2020 results just came out in December. So it was very exciting to see these. Now, of the 375 bee species on record in Alberta, so 375 species. So first of all, that's a huge number. That's almost twice as many as all the fish, amphibian, mammal, and reptile species combined, almost twice as many, and it rivals bird diversity, which is, notoriously huge. So 375 bee species, 2% or 7 species are exotic or non-native. About 30% are considered to be secure or apparently secure. So those bee species are doing okay. About 10% are vulnerable or at risk. So 10% we're concerned about, and a very alarming 58% or almost 2/3 are unrankable, and they're unrankable because we don't have enough information to speak or to assign a conservation status ranking to those species. So this is, it's great that about 1/3 of our bee species are fine, but there's a whole lot more work that we need to do to understand what bee species are here, where are they, and how they're doing. We've got some other research that was done here in Alberta as well. These are unpublished data. That was from a long-term study in Waterton Lakes National Park here in southern Alberta. It was initiated by Dr. Ken Richards, who is an Ag Canada researcher at the Lethbridge Research Center and a bit of a legend in the bee world. He taught us a lot about native bee biology, how they nest and that sort of thing, and really contributed a lot to bumblebee research and other pollinators as well. So Ken started this research in the 90s, and so he walked transects in Waterton, and he observed bees over a certain area and over a certain time. So we got 2 metrics. So we got bees per hectare and bees per hour, and you can see very clearly from this graph that from the 90s to the 2020s, the bees per hour and the bees per hectare declined by almost half. And that's a local example here in Alberta in, again, a protected area, which should be one of the most pristine, places or intact ecosystems. So this is alarming, an example of insect or bee decline right here in Alberta. So what's happening? Why are bees particularly being impacted? So they're being impacted by a number of things. So number one, and a major driver of biodiversity loss across the world is habitat loss. Habitat loss is a major issue. So bees and all organisms, they evolved in these systems, and they evolved with the native plants that provide, in many cases, both the food and the nesting resources that they need. And when we go and change these habitats and we remove the plants and the resources the bees need, and we turn them into, especially when we turn them into monocultures, that have low diversity and low complexity, that can be very poor bee habitat. So habitat loss is a major driver for bee decline and biodiversity decline across the world. Pesticides are an issue as well. Pesticides for example, neonicotinoids, I'm sure that's a group of pesticides that you've heard about. They have been making the headlines lately. So those are insecticides that are systemic insecticides, and they're typically used as a seed coat. So crops like some canola crops, the seed is coated with a neonicotinoid pesticide, the plant takes it up, and then the pesticide is present in the pollen and nectar that the bees forage on. So there's, you know, I wouldn't even say that we're calling for, we don't have a stance on pesticides, but I wouldn't say we're calling for an all-out ban on things like neonicotinoids, but what we've seen through research is that they're widely overused. We can use them, but we have to, you know, instead of treating your whole crop with the neonicotinoid pesticide before you even have a problem, plant your crop and monitor it for problems and then treat as needed and utilize an integrated pest management system. That's really, we really just need to be smarter about the way that we're using some of these things and use them less. Pathogens are a major issue as well. And pathogens, pests, pathogens, diseases, bacteria, you know, all kinds of things. So our bee species evolved with many of these pathogens, and we're also concerned about novel pathogens, like we just saw in humans with coronavirus or COVID-19, where, you know, when a species doesn't have an adaptation and it hasn't been exposed to something, the results can be quite devastating. And then climate change is another issue as well. So climate change, you know, we're seeing some new studies, interesting studies coming out recently that are showing or suggesting that, you know, it might be these high intense weather events that might be really harshly impacting insects and bees as well. So high heat for long for long periods of time can cause bee mortality or can be damaging to bees, as well as some cold temperatures in the winter as well. And of course, we're concerned about the asynchronicity of flowers blooming and bees emerging as well. That can be problematic. And what I've got on the screen for you here, you can see this is a crop field. I don't know if that's potatoes. I'm not sure. Some of these are shamelessly stolen photos from the internet too, but this is for educational purposes. So we have a crop field, which is totally a monoculture. And then below we have this beautiful native rangeland in I believe the Montaigne area, and you can see the big balsam root flowers, and there's all kinds of other stuff happening here too. There's tons of other plant species that are flowering. There's food for bees, there's nesting resources, and there's just the complexity and diversity that our bees need. So one of these is great bee habitat, and it's not the picture on the top. So quiz time. How much do we know about bees here in the group? So what I want you to do is have a look. Oh, some of the numbers are cut off a little bit, but have a look at the bees on the screen, or the images, I should say, on the screen. And I want you to tell me which are non-bees. And maybe, I don't know if we can throw the comments in the chat or what's the best thing to do here, but or even write down your answers. I'll give you a moment or two to have a good look. You're trying to figure out which are non-bees. Now, these aren't crazy tropical insects. These are insects that all of which you'd find right here in Alberta. So it's not that tricky. Someone suggested, so a couple of people have suggested they're all bees. Okay, so that's an answer. Does anybody else have any suggestions as to which may or may not be bees? So someone's suggesting 1 is not, oh, 9. 7 is not a bee. 4, 5, and 7 are non-bees. So another one is saying, oh, none are bees, I think. So, okay, so one new message, number 8. Yeah, 1 is not, okay. I love that you're putting your answers in there. 7, 4, and 10. 10, okay. They are all bees. So I'm going to give you guys the answer. I love the level of participation. This is fantastic. It might not be what you think. So there is, in fact, so 9 of these images are bees and 1 is not. And number 9 here, whose number is cut off, this is not a bee. And this was tricky because this is a bee mimic. So number 9, this is a fly that mimics bees, but you can tell it's not a bee. Like, have a close look at the eyes on this insect. These are big, goofy looking, typical fly eyes. If you have a look, you can totally tell that that's a fly. And if you have a close look as well, although some of these other bee species is not obvious, but flies have a single set of wings and bees have 2, although in all of these photos, it is hard to tell that the bee species have 2. All of the other images on the screen are bees, and they're all bee species that we have right here in Alberta. And this is what, when I first started learning about bees, I could not believe that these are literal bee species that we have right here. And you can find these guys right in your backyard. So it's absolutely incredible. So let's start talking about some of the different bee species that we have. So we've got bumblebees. You guys all know what bumblebees are, what they look like, what they sound like. We're all familiar with bumblebees because they're big and they're loud and they're obvious. Bumblebees really fit the bill of what we think of when we think about bees. They're social insects. And that means that, they live together. There's a queen bee, there's a worker bee, and there's a male bee. Or those are the different types of bees in a bee colony, I should say. Now, the queens and the workers are both females, and the main difference is that the queens are fed more food and better quality food while they're developing, which, as you can see, allows them to grow larger in size and to have fully developed reproductive bits, which is important because the queen's role is really to lay eggs. Now, the worker bees, they're females as well. The queen produces all the workers. The workers go out and do all the work. They collect the food. They bring it back. They feed the developing bees. They fan the nest entrance to cool it off on hot days. They're doing all the work. And then the males have a very singular role in the bee world. We joke about this all the time, but their job is to emerge, mate, and die. And it's very singular, but very important for sustaining our bee populations. So these are all species. These are all individuals of a Bombus nevadensis. So a bumblebee. So these are Bombus nevadensis species. This is the biggest bumblebee that we get in Alberta. I should have something in there for scale, but I don't. But the bumblebee nevadensis queens can be quite large. So this is their life cycle. So right now in Alberta, all of the bumblebees that we have are mated queens that are hibernating. So they're typically hibernating in the soil or some insulating medium where they're just they've gone to sleep for the winter. They're going to merge in the spring where they're going to need food. So early spring flowers are super important for those newly emerged bumblebee queens. So they need to fuel up. Once they've gotten some food, then they need to go find a nest. And in the wild, bumblebees are going to nest in old rodent holes, under tussocks of grass, under piles of downed debris. I always have bumblebees nesting in my wood pile. So this is a bumblebee in an old rodent hole, likely. And so she creates out of a waxy-like substance a little vessel that is a honey pot. And that's where she will go out and store her honeybee honey. And that's right here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. This is her honey pot. She'll then lay eggs in cells out of a similar waxy-like substance. Those eggs will develop into larvae and then pupae, and then will emerge as workers after a few weeks. So the bumblebee colony will grow in size as the season progresses. The queen will continually keep producing workers. The workers, once emerged, will go out and do all the foraging and perform all of the duties of the colony. And then towards the end of the season, the queen will produce eggs that will become new queens, and she produces eggs that will become males. So those new queens and the males, they leave the colony and they mate. And then at this point, everybody else dies off. So the founding queen, the worker bees, the male bees, everybody dies off. They have an annual life cycle. And it's only that newly emerged, newly mated queen bee that goes on to overwinter. And that's again where we are right now. Is those mated queens that are hibernating that will go on to start colonies in the next year. So all of our native bees have an annual life cycle. That's how they evolved to deal with winters. It would be a really hard time to be a bee out here in Alberta right now, or in December or January. There's no food, and the weather is quite horrible. So that's how they learn to evolve with our climate. This is what the inside of a bumblebee nest looks like. So you've got your queen bee here. You've got worker bees. You have developing bees inside these nest cells. You've got spent nest cells that are being used to store honey. You can see this bumblebee honey in these little pots, essentially. This is why we don't harvest native bee honey and bumblebee honey, because there's like a thimble-sized amount of bumblebee honey in this nest, right? Like it really would either have to be so expensive, and it would be really detrimental to the colony. So we don't harvest bumblebee honey. So I'm going to focus in, I think we're doing okay for time, on a couple of our bumblebee species of note. So one is the western bumblebee. This is Bombus occidentalis. She's a beautiful bee with a white bum. And this was once the most common bumblebee in all of Western Canada. And over the span of about 20 years, it went from being one of the most common bumblebees to becoming one of the most rare. Now, what we think happened was that there was a disease that was spread, and this bee and bees that are closely related to it might be more susceptible to this disease, which is spread through a bacteria in their poop, essentially. Now, to tell a little bit more about the story, a little bit more background, the western bumblebee was one of the first bees that we utilized as a domesticated species for greenhouse pollination. So did you know that we use bumblebees to pollinate our greenhouse crops? Very widespread practice across Canada, certainly in the Medicine Hat area where we have lots of greenhouses. They purchase bumblebee colonies, put them in their greenhouses, and then the bumblebees go pollinate things like tomatoes. They're really effective at pollinating certain greenhouse plant species. So the western bumblebee was primarily the species that was used for a long, long time. And we think that that disease kind of spread through the domesticated populations and into the wild. And there may be some linkage there. But it's interesting to, really sit back and look at why this particular species has been so greatly impacted when other bumblebee species are doing fine, seemingly fine, or maybe even increasing in their relative abundance. So this is the Western bumblebee. And another similar, I guess, another species that I want to point out is the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. So this is not a regular bumblebee. This is a nest parasite. This is a Cytherus. This is a subgenus of bumblebees called the Cytherus. And this bumblebee, it emerges a little bit later in the season. And instead of seeking out its own nest to establish and do all the work, it seeks out nests of bumblebees that have already established nests. And it will invade the nest or the colony and, challenge the queen essentially to the death. And when she wins, and they often do, she will force the founding or the existing bumblebee workers to rear her offspring. So this might sound like a horrible story. The insect world is so mean. What is going on? Well, this might make you feel a little bit better. So this is our gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. She has a regular, this picture's a bit fuzzy, I apologize. She has a regular kind of hairy leg. This is a regular bumblebee over here. And you can see that she's packed pollen in on her hind leg. And she has special hairs on her back leg to help her hold that pollen in place. And she has a smooth concavity underneath this pollen ball. So you'll see bumblebees like grooming themselves and packing pollen into this special portion on their back leg. Well, the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee doesn't have that adaptation. She literally cannot forage on her own, and she's reliant on invading these existing bumblebee colonies in order to reproduce. So that always makes me feel a little bit better. She's got no choice. Well, the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee was never a super common bumblebee in Alberta, but it was always present and often found in surveys, but it started declining as well. And until recently, with more robust surveys, we didn't have any confirmed reports of the species since the 80s or 90s. So it was becoming we were very concerned about it. And it was regulated and placed on the Federal Species Risk Act as well as an endangered bee species. So this is good. We're recognizing a decline. We're doing something about it. But the reason for this decline, we think, might be that the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee has a preference for invading the Western bumblebee nests. So what we're seeing here potentially is humans got involved and we domesticated the Western bumblebee. And then we were using this bee for agricultural greenhouse pollination. And then we think a disease spread through was really hard on the Western bumblebee wild populations. And now we're seeing declines in the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee that relies on the Western bumblebee to reproduce. So it's a big, long story to say that we need to be very careful in doing things when there's often unintended consequences. And we need to be very careful about moving things around and dealing with managed bee species as well. So we're going to switch gears. We are going to talk about solitary bees. And this is really where things get exciting. So this is a generic life cycle of a solitary bee. Now, when we talk about solitary bees, we mean anything other than honeybees or bumblebees, pretty much. And that's so many bee species, and it's not even accurate because there's lots of solitary bee species, some of them that are social, some that are a little bit social, and some that kind of nest in aggregations. And so it's more of a continuum rather than these discrete categories. So here's like a generalization of a life cycle of a ground nesting solitary bee, which is probably the majority of them. So we have an adult bee on this flower. She has adaptations on her hind legs for packing pollen in. You can see the yellow bits on her legs. She's collecting pollen. She's going to go back to this little nest cell that she dug out of the soil. She'll leave behind a pollen ball and she'll pack it all together. And then she lays an egg. So you can see this little tiny white egg on top of this pollen ball. At that point, the female bee is gonna seal up that nest cell. And then she really doesn't have any other interaction with her offspring. So that egg develops into a larvae and then a pupae, and then typically will emerge as an adult in the following year. So once they emerge, the males and females all emerge together, they mate, and then the females go on and the cycle continues again. So that's much more typical than, a bumblebee life cycle, which is really probably more along the lines of what we think of. So in Alberta, we have a few main different categories of bees. I see some of my text is cut off on this. That was my fault. So we have leafcutter bees. So leafcutter bees and mason bees, I should have had some props in front of me, but they're the ones that will nest in those bee hotels. So those are ones with the tubes, and they create these nest cells. So leafcutter bees create nest cells out of leaves. And so they'll create a little cell and they'll leave behind a pollen ball, and then they'll lay an egg inside it, seal it up, and then they'll create a series of those nest cells in the tube. The mason bees do that, but they use mud or clay instead of leaves. And those are all, mason bees and leafcutter bees are in the same family. The next we have mining bees. So these are the andrenids. These are a really species-rich group that we have. Some of the earliest emerging solitary bees that we have are in this group, and these are really beautiful bees. And they're primarily ground nesters as well, where their name mining bees comes from. The next are the plasterer bees. So these bees get their names because they make little nest cells in the ground, and they'll line the nest cell with a cellophane-like lining to waterproof it to kind of help protect their developing bee. And then we have the sweat bees. So all the photos on the bottom are sweat bees, and this is where you get some of the craziest colors and color patterns. These are all bees that you could find here, and they're really, truly amazing. And whether you know it or not, probably everyone here has had an interaction with a sweat bee. Again, whether you know it or not, they're very common for them to land on your skin, and they'll use the proboscis to lap up the salt from your sweat. So you probably just brush them off and would dismiss them as, a fly or a mosquito or something. And some of these little sweat bees are teeny, teeny, tiny. Very, very tiny, black, dark green. You would probably dismiss them as ants or flying ants or something like that if you were to get a close look. But most often those are bees, especially if you're seeing them in flowers. So what do our bees need? This is the most boring slide. I've really pondered what to put on this slide, but really it comes down to two fundamental things: food and shelter. They need somewhere to nest, and they need food. It's really basic stuff. So I thought maybe this was the best way to get that across. So let's talk about bee food. Well, bees, of course, rely on the pollen and nectar from flowers, right? And what is best for our native bees are the native flowers that we have. So in the bee world, we have a spectrum, again, a continuum of specialization. So many of our bee species, like all of our bumblebees, are what we call generalists. So they're like me. They're not a fussy eater. They'll eat pretty much anything. If there's a flower, it's producing pollen or nectar, they'll go forage on it. But then there's other bees that are much more fussy eaters. So some of them will only forage off of a particular flower species or genera. So things get a little bit more complicated, right? When we start manipulating habitat for those specialist species that rely on a single flower species. And a great example of that is, so this is the common harebell, Campanula rotundifolia, and there's a little sweat bee called the common harebell sweat bee that only forages on common harebell. So incorporating native plants, protecting the native ecosystems that we have, and bringing more and more native plants and restoring native ecosystem is really critical to native bee conservation, to make sure that we can serve all of the native bee species that we have. And what I have on the screen here, again, more stolen photos. I apologize. I should really do better and get my own, but is an abundance of flowers, and an example of flower species that are different shapes and sizes and colors, and that have different bloom times. So, the three-flowered avens and the golden beans are early bloomers, and these asters and the goldenrod are late bloomers. So we need flowers blooming all season long for the bumblebees that are active all season long, for the early spring queens, right up to the ones that are gearing up for hibernation, just too many of our solitary bees that are only active for 3, 4, 5 weeks out of the summer. It's really important that there's food available for all the bees when they're active. The other thing is, some of those little bees, like I mentioned, some little bees are like this big, and a big Bombus nevadensis queen is this big. So those bees have very different morphology and have the ability to forage differently on flowers. So having a variety of different types of flowers, flowers with shallow corollas and deep corollas can facilitate foraging by all of these different bee species. So we need, much like bees come in every different shape and color and size, and are active at different times throughout the season, we need flowers in every different shape and color and size that bloom throughout the season. We need to match that back up. We need that diversity. That is critical to bee conservation. And then bees also need a place to live. So I'll start at the bottom. These are all kind of look the same. They're all kind of the same color. So this is a bumblebee nest in the wild. It looks like this is under someone's step or something like that. And so bumblebees, like, they really just want to open like a cavity that they can get into that's protected from the elements and from predators. There's also, access to bare soil is really important for so many of our solitary ground nesting bees, and is something that's often overlooked, I think, in bee conservation initiatives. So we'd never, advocate for like, you need to keep this field all bare soil. Like, that would be a weed nightmare. And for my day job, I work for the Alberta Invasive Species Council. That's not what we're advocating for. But, incorporating small areas of bare soil, especially where you have sandy soil, can be really beneficial to these native bees. Other bees can actually like excavate wood. It's particularly soft or decaying wood can be really, really useful for them. Some of them can utilize old beetle galleries as well. So, if you have an old log or a down tree, leave it in your yard. The more we can mimic nature and the natural diversity of things in a native ecosystem, the better. So diversity is really the key to our native bee conservation. So this is your second quiz of the night. This one's really easy. One of these pictures is good bee habitat and one is not. And I know it's almost facetious because it's so apparent, but the crazy thing here is the lawn on the left, it is so high maintenance. It is so hard to keep a lawn like this with only long grass, nothing else growing in it. And I don't know how anybody gets marks like that in their lawn from mowing, but this person spends a lot of time doing it. The yard on the right, I don't know if you know Alex Farmer. She's an instructor at Mount Royal University, co-founder of the Bee Council. This is her backyard. And when you are in her backyard in the summer, it is buzzing. It is alive. And now you can't tell from the photo, but there are flower species here that are going to bloom all season long. You've got pink flowers and blue flowers and yellow flowers and red flowers and white flowers. You have different flower morphology. Some of these flower species have hollow stems that can be really beneficial for those tube, like leaf cutters and mason bees that'll nest in the bee hotels. They need those tubes. You've got some bare soil here, not all, but you've got a little bit of bare soil here up at the front, really great for ground nesting bees to access. You've got a beautiful pink bumblebee box taped to this tree at the back, and a bench here for bee watching, which is maybe the most important part because that's what you're going to want to do if you go to this yard. So the moral of the story here is that complexity and diversity are the key to creating good bee habitat. Native plants, incorporate native plants as much as you can. You don't have to have exclusively native plants, but work on it and incorporate those as much as you can. And this over here, this is a bee desert. This is not a great place for bee watching, and it's not a great place for bees to live. So that's a really important moral of the story. So 32 minutes in. Okay, I think we're doing okay for time. I might have to pick up the speed a bit. We are going to switch gears again. And now we're going to talk about managed bees. So this is a European honeybee. So this might be the other kind of image that comes to mind when you think about bees. So honeybees are very familiar to us. We're often very familiar with this image. Now in North America, there are no native honeybees to North America. All of our honeybees have been imported. They have been here for a long time. They were originally brought over by European settlers for wax and for honey production. And more recently, they've become a really, really important part in our agricultural ecosystem. So this is a map of the annual American honeybee migration. And like literally almost all the honeybees in the United States are packaged up and thrown on the back of flatbed trucks and shipped to California for almond pollination for at least a month. At the end of that, they're packed back up, moved across the country to go to the next crop. So this practice, as you can imagine, is not super great for honeybees because they're moving across time zones. They are kind of force-fed a single species for a month or 2 months at a time. And then they also, perhaps the most risky practice associated with this is the moving about of honeybees, bringing them together to mingle and then moving them back out. So that's a huge potential for disease transmission, which is very, very, very important for honeybees. Probably one of the biggest things facing honeybees right now are varroa mites. And I apologize for the quality of this image. It's another still an internet image, but it just really shows what we're dealing with. So these brown blobs are varroa mites, and varroa mites attack honeybee colonies, and they can transmit diseases like twisted wing disease, which is what you're seeing in the adult bee on the right, which makes it pretty much a non-productive member of the colony. Varroa mites are a major issue, and we're losing the battle with varroa mites because the treatments that we have for them the varroa mites are becoming resistant to the treatments. So it's very problematic. And there are certainly things impacting honeybees, and we hear about it all the time in the news. We hear about honeybee issues all the time in the news. Fortunately, in Alberta, we have a piece of legislation called the Alberta Bee Act. This is a piece of legislation that is entirely devoted to honeybee sustainability. It's one of the reasons why Alberta has really sustainable honeybee populations. This legislation requires beekeepers to report on the amount of honeybee colonies that they have, the densities, where they are, and their status. So, beekeepers unwrap their hives in the spring and they have a look. Did they survive the winter? Did they not? And every single winter, we get a very clear snapshot of how our honeybee colonies are doing and how they overwintered. And when you really dive a little bit deeper into the reasons of or the causes behind honeybee decline, it's often that the honeybees froze to death, starved to death, or had something like varroa mites or another disease that needed to be treated. So honeybees are an important species, but they are a livestock species of management concern. And that is a very important distinction. Be a very, very important distinction. And what about our native bees? We don't have any legislation that is devoted to native bee sustainability. There's the Alberta Wildlife Act that has a section for endangered invertebrates, and there's not a single species listed on there. And that's not because there are no endangered invertebrates in Alberta. There's the Federal Species at Risk Act with about a half dozen species like Bombus bohemica, the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee we talked about, that's listed. But there are major gaps in the Federal Species at Risk Act. It only offers actual effective protection on federal land, which includes airports, national parks, and indigenous reserves, or where areas where species critical habitat has been delineated, which are few and far between. Our native bees are faced with all of the same issues that honeybees are faced with, yet there's no agency tasked with monitoring and making sure they're okay. In addition to all of those same factors that are impacting honeybees, that are impacting our native bees, they're also dealing with increasing impacts from managed bees. So I should say that they're dealing with increased pressure from managed bees because there are ever increasing numbers of managed bees in Alberta. So these managed bees, like honeybees, can be problematic for our native bees in two ways. So one, they can compete with them for limited food resources. And two, they can transmit diseases. And we've even found examples in Alberta of honeybee-specific diseases being found in bumblebees. So we've confirmed reports of twisted wing disease in bumblebees in Alberta, which is a honeybee-specific disease. Again, problematic because those native bees shouldn't have any previous adaptations because they haven't been exposed to these diseases. So really, really problematic. Now, this is a controversial question. What is the impact here? What is happening? And I think for a long, long time, the jury was out. You would look in the literature, you'd find papers that said, yes, there are impacts. You'd find papers that no, there are impacts. There are no impacts. And so what really can we take from that? Well, more recently, there's been new studies that are kind of shedding new light. And I don't think it's safe to say the jury's out anymore. It's safe to say there are impacts. We are seeing impacts from managed bees on wild or native bees. So one example is this is a review paper. So these review papers are really important because they're looking at all the published research on this topic. So this Wojcik et al. 2018 paper, there was a meta-analysis. They've reviewed all of the published papers that asked the question, are managed bees impacting native bees? And they came up with 81 studies that asked that question. Here's the kicker. Of the 81 studies that were published that asked this question, only 7 assessed direct measures of ecological fitness, so fecundity, of reproductive output. That is the only way you can answer that question. So essentially, these are the studies we need to look at to really get to the bottom of this. And the researchers found 6 out of the 7 of those papers found direct negative impacts of managed bees on wild bees. So that, when we look at all of the peer-reviewed literature on the topic and we're seeing results like this, that's very stark and very much, I think, a very telling story. There were researchers that took a different approach to answer this question too. In 2016, two researchers, they said, well, what if we just quantify the amount of food the honeybees eat? And what they figured that a honeybee colony that has about 40,000 bees in it can consume in a single season the same amount of food that could sustain 100,000 native solitary bees. So one honeybee colony is consuming the same amount of food that could sustain 100,000 native solitary bees. So that's a big number, but does it matter? Like, does it matter? How do we figure this out? So let's look at it in the provincial context. So according to the Alberta Beekeepers Report, which from the Alberta Bee Act, beekeepers are reporting back on their colonies. We know there are at least 300,000 honeybee colonies in Alberta. When you times each one of those colonies by the amount of food each one of them consumes in a single season, we've now, which is 100,000 native solitary bees, or equivalent to that, you've now removed the amount of food from an ecosystem, from all of Alberta's ecosystems, that could sustain 30 billion native solitary bees. And that is raising alarm bells, certainly with us, certainly with me. So this is not to say that honeybees have killed 30 billion native solitary bees. And this is not to say that we can't have honeybees or anything like that. But this is alarming. We need to figure out, is food limiting? In what ecosystems is food limiting? And then that can help us understand where we can have honeybee colonies with and mitigate impacts to native bees. One can only assume, though, as an ecologist, that because organisms kind of distribute themselves based on the amount of available resources, that food is probably going to be limited in many systems, though. So we really need to answer more questions about this to figure out the magnitude of this impact and to learn how to mitigate those impacts. And this is particularly important to us here. It's important to us for a couple of reasons. So the first is that we all know the difference between a chicken and a mountain bluebird. So yes, they're all birds, but one of these species is a livestock species of management concern, and the other is a wildlife species of conservation concern. Now, the exact same statement is true for bees. So honeybees are a livestock species of management concern, and native bees, like bumblebees, are wildlife species of conservation concern. And it's really important that we separate the conversations about these two different types of bees, even though many of the solutions to bee decline, to all bee decline, are similar or the same. Plant food, habitat, reduce pesticides, like a lot of those things are going to help all bees. These are two fundamentally different things, and I think it's really important that we do separate the discussions about that. And the media is notorious for kind of muddying these waters, but that's why it's important that we're here and we talk about these things. The other thing is the researchers have coined the term, I'm sure you've heard of greenwashing. Well, there's a term called bee washing, and we see that everywhere. So case in point, this is a bit dated now. Cheerios has done better in recent years, but it's still not great. They first came out with their Help Bring Back the Bees campaign a few years ago now. So you need to help buzz the bee for Honey Nut Cheerios. So Buzz is, of course, a honeybee. And you could have read every single piece of information on this campaign and not realize that honeybees were a non-native livestock species. And it was kind of misinformed and misguided. And the seed packets, don't get me started about that, problematic as well. But I'd like to say we are getting better and we're seeing less bee washing, but we still see evidence of it all the time. I'm going to just whisper, I was at the Edmonton Expo Center, and they're touting their, net zero waste and talking about their sustainability. And part of their sustainability plan was having honeybees to build a more resilient ecosystem. Well, would you ever get chickens to build a more resilient ecosystem? No, you would get chickens because you want to harvest the meat and eat eggs, which is not a bad thing, but you're not doing it for resiliency in your ecosystem. So, it's problematic. Also in Alberta, we have 40% of Canada's honeybee colonies, and that number's doubled since 1987 with no consideration for density of placements of hives, for the consideration and sustainability of our native bee species, right? It's really about understanding when honeybees have an impact, what systems, where can we put them, what are the densities of hives? We don't have those answers, and until we do, we need to be utilizing the precautionary principle, which simply states if we don't know but speculate there might be a problem, we should use caution and proceed with caution. And we're not really doing that. We're not doing that very well. And you saw this slide earlier. It's back up again because, again, almost 2/3 of our native bee species, we don't know how they're doing because we don't have enough data because we're not doing enough monitoring. We don't understand enough to be able to assign a conservation status ranking to them, let alone the 9% that are deemed to be vulnerable. Now, I always spend a lot of time in my talks beating up on honeybees, but beekeepers are not bad people and honeybees are not bad. And who here likes honey? I mean, I like honey. We have honey at our house. We like it. Honeybees are the only bees we're going to get honey from. And honeybees are a really important part of our agricultural systems. We're not calling for a ban on honeybees. Honeybees are going nowhere. What we are calling for is increased awareness of the difference between managed bees and wild bees, and increase, mitigations to make sure that our honeybees are not impacting our native bees, and more research for native bees as well. So we don't hate honeybees. Honeybees are good. We just have to use some caution, and we need to learn more. We need to do more research. Alarmingly, though, too, is that, I beat up a lot on honeybees, but they're probably not even the most detrimental or problematic managed bee species. This big, beautiful bumblebee here on this dandelion, this is Bombus impatiens. This is the common eastern bumblebee. Well, we've since stopped using the western bumblebee for use in greenhouse pollination and started using the common eastern bumblebee. And I think that's because the western bumblebee species were declining. It's not quite clear to me why that was, but we now use the common eastern bumblebee. Well, we are now finding the common eastern bumblebee, which, as you guessed it, is not native to Western Canada. We're finding this bee in the wild in southern Alberta near greenhouses. So is this an invasive species? Can this outcompete native species for habitat and food? Can it spread diseases? All these kinds of things, very concerning. And then we have alfalfa leafcutter bees, a non-native agricultural species. We do have native leafcutter bees. We talked about that. This is a non-native species used in alfalfa and canola pollination. And we don't really understand the extent or distribution of alfalfa leafcutter bees. Are they becoming invasive? Are they outcompeting and displacing native species? We don't really know. And then on the bottom, this is the blue orchard mason bee. This is a native species. It's the one you can buy bee cocoons and then release them, which is really cool, but not going to do anything to help the bees. And again, it's kind of touted, kind of sold as this green initiative. And again, coolness factor is high, sustainability, ecological factor low. So keep that in mind. But people are being encouraged to release these things. And again, you might be introducing maladaptive genes, because a lot of the blue orchard mason bee that are sold are produced, on the coast. So that can be problematic anyway. So we really, and there's very few rules about moving non-honeybees within Canada. You can do pretty much whatever you want. We need to increase those rules just because of issues with the risk of invasive potential, as well as the spread of diseases. So lots of things that we need to do there. And these are just a few of the reasons why we started the Alberta Native Bee Council in 2017. And we have a passionate group of volunteers. We've been officially an organization for 5 years. We've been doing this kind of work for almost 15. We've been entirely volunteer run up until a month ago, when we hired Samantha Morris, who is in attendance tonight, as a contractor for us to do some work. We have a little bit of seed money. We are so excited. If we were able to do the stuff that I'm about to tell you to do in the last 5 years as a volunteer organization, we are going to be able to do so much more now that we have some staff capacity. We're so lucky to have Sam. She's a recent MSc graduate, and she is amazing. I'm very excited about the future. Really quickly, some of the things that we've been doing. We implemented almost province-wide monitoring in 2018. I'll talk about that briefly. Our citizen science bumblebee box monitoring program, really fun stuff. We'll talk about that. We have some native plant lists. I'll show you those as well. Then we also have other resources such as Guide to Bumblebees of Southern Alberta, best practices for solitary bee hotels. We didn't even have time to get into that tonight, but you really want to buyer beware. If you're buying a solitary bee hotel, do your research to make sure those things are properly made. We contributed best practices for native bees for the environmental farm plan. Finished research with Waterton Lakes National Park. We're working on another contract with them. And we also offer outreach programs, presentations, all kinds of bee programming. So, and we're charging a fair amount of money for it, I'm not going to lie, but because we need to build our revenue, because we need to maintain our staff so that we can continue to do this really important work. So if you're interested in any of those, reach out to us or check out our website. Really quickly, this wild bee monitoring program that we implemented in 2018. So first off, full disclosure, this was destructive sampling. Not a popular thing to do, but necessary in order to answer the questions that we want to do. In almost all entomological research, there's destructive sampling involved, but this was the most robust sampling to date of native bees in a single season in Alberta. This was the result of so many volunteer individuals and agencies. It was absolutely amazing. It has taken us like 5 years to, so first what had to happen is we had to wash and then blow dry and then sort and then pin and then label and database and identify all of the bees. So it's a super labor intensive endeavor. We're so proud of this. Through this, we've expanded ranges of many bumblebee species in Alberta, added 3 bumblebees to the species list for Alberta. It wasn't captured in the Canadian status report, but it will be in the next one. Our data has already been incorporated into bumblebee recovery strategies. This is so important. We've had to delay. We're hoping to do this same type of monitoring every 5 years or so, or something along those lines, but we've had to delay because of funding. So it is funding dependent. But I can't stress enough. I know there's fellow entomologists on the webinar tonight, but there is such a need for creative and innovative monitoring and conservation initiatives, especially for insects. There's just not enough money, and these things are so important to us. We can't go back in time and collect baseline data. We need to understand what's happening now, and we need to take action to help protect our insects and our bee species. These are some examples of some of the outputs that we're working on. We have confirmed committed in-kind support from the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute. These guys are way smarter than we are. They know how to manipulate, they know how to deal with data. They're producing these beautiful maps. This is our map for Bombus mixtus, one of the more common bumblebees. Is a forest bumblebee species in Alberta, beautiful bee. The red dots are locations where we found it at our sites. We also have a breakdown of the probability of occurrence in different ecoregions and habitat suitability maps. We have there's so much we are going to do with our data once they're finalized. We're so excited to bring that to you in the next year or so. 49 minute. Okay, I'm wrapping up here. So the Citizen Science Bumblebee Box Monitoring Program, this program is so much fun. In 5 years, we've distributed at least 1,200 bumblebee boxes, but we've had low reporting, and that's my fault because we've been volunteer run and we haven't been very coordinated and good at reminding people. So we're going to be better at that. We know people at bumblebee boxes want to hear back from you. So low reporting, about 10% of people that have built boxes report back, but we've found 15 to 30% colonization rates in our boxes, which is on par with what we found in the research. And interestingly and surprisingly to us, the above ground boxes are more often colonized, and the sweet spot seems to be at about 1.5 meters above the ground. So we have our first report for this program. We're so delinquent on stuff, but we're doing the best we can. That will be coming out to you soon as well. We're really excited about that. We've developed wildflowers for Alberta's wild bees list. So this is our top 12. We also have a laundry list of tons of different species, just in an Excel format on our spreadsheet. That's a free download. So is this. We've broken down the species, whether by the type, whether they're a forb or a shrub, bloom period, flower type, flower color, what natural region they're native to, pardon me, their sun and their moisture requirements, and whether they have hollow stems that can provide nesting habitat as well. So if you're interested in increasing native plants in your garden, I would start here. We also cross-reference this plant species list with native plant suppliers to make sure these ones were commonly available, and they are. If you are interested in learning more, check out our website. There is so much information on there. We had one of our volunteers, Betty Beswick, who is incredible, put together almost all the content. There's so much information on all of the native bee genera. Bumblebees of Southern Alberta, the identification guide to common queens is there. The native plants for native bees, the best practices for solitary bee hotels, and the bee box building instructions are there as well. Also, you might want to take a screenshot of this, but there's a few books that you should just go right now and buy them. They're all awesome. This one is fresh off the press. This is The Bees of the World, A Guide to Every Family by Lawrence Packer. It's on the screen. This, you guys, this is a book that you will leave on your coffee table. Oh, I don't know if you can see this. The photos are amazing. Like, it's just photographing bees is hard, which is why I steal photos. And this is absolutely incredible stuff. The Bees in Your Backyard, another great book, really talks about the different genera and when they're active, where there are really, really good stuff here. So to summarize, there are lots of different native bee species, almost as many bee species as birds. It's absolutely incredible. We have seen a drastic decline in bee abundance in certain areas, and we know insects are declining generally. We really, really need to do better to understand changes to bee populations and to mitigate impacts from things we know are impacting them. And there are small things that everyone can do to help. Those include understanding the difference between managed bees and native bees. That's really easy. You just understand that difference. You can also create habitat for wild bees or native bees by incorporating diversity into your landscaping and adding flowers in general. And if you can, focus on native flowers. And I'm going to shamelessly encourage you to support the Native Bee Council and other great grassroots organizations, Nature Alberta, the Alberta Native Plant Council, so many great people working towards conserving biodiversity, which is so important because once we lose it, we won't get it back. But these are all grassroots organizations doing really incredible work with volunteers. So become a member, buy their merchandise, and stay in touch with all those organizations as well. So I'll leave you with a link to our website, our email address, acknowledge some of our core sponsors that have helped us throughout the years. And I'm wearing my Alberta Native Bee Council t-shirt right now. We have those on our online store. Everybody needs one. And hopefully there's just a few minutes for questions. So awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. I know I learned a ton. I'm just going to stop the recording and then I will read out some questions from the chat here.
Okay.